Welcome back to the I Take History with My Coffee podcast, where we explore history in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Pontus Pion, Memoirs, circa 1570. The general government and superintendence of affairs was left to Madame Margaret of Austria, Duchess of Parma, imitator of the virtues of the late Emperor Charles, her father, who had as her principal counselor Monsieur Antoine Perrenot, Bishop of Arras, who subsequently became cardinal, surnamed Granvelle, one of the foremost men in the world in matters of state, in whom the king placed his trust above all others. In the summer of 1559, Philip II of Spain bid farewell to the Netherlands. He had spent 4 years in the Low Countries, years of war, treaty making, and the careful management of 17 complex provinces, the wealthiest territory in his empire. He departed from Zealand in August, boarding the fleet that would carry him to Spain. He embraced his nobles and distributed money according to rank. By all accounts, he was warm and generous in his farewells. Philip at his most personally gracious, the sovereign saying a sincere goodbye to a people he would never see again. Before he left, he made 2 sets of promises. To William of Orange and Lamoral of Egmont, 2 of the Netherlands' greatest noblemen, men who had fought his wars and expected to govern their provinces, he gave his personal word that nothing of consequence would be decided without their knowledge. They had asked for this assurance, and Philip gave it to them face to face. Then he boarded the ship. On board, in his final moments on Netherlandish soil, he gave a different instruction. This one to his half-sister Margaret, the woman he was leaving behind as his regent. The instruction was verbal, delivered at the rail. It told her to consult privately with 3 men: Antoine Perrenot de Granvelle, the jurist Viglius von Aita, and the nobleman Berlaymont, before anything reached the full council. Orange and Egmont, despite what Philip had just told them, were to have no part in these private deliberations. 2 sets of promises, 1 set kept. The German historian Felix Rockvall, who spent years in the archives reconstructing this moment, called it deliberate double dealing. He used the German word Doppelzüngigkeit, double-tonguedness. But before we understand what Philip thought he was doing, we need to understand who he left behind to carry it out. 2 other women had held this title before her, and both held it with distinction. Margaret of Austria, Charles V's aunt, the woman who governed the Netherlands from 1507 to 1530, negotiated the Ladies' Peace of Cambrai, and corresponded with Charles as a political equal. She did not execute his will from a distance. She shaped it, up close, in dialogue. When she disagreed, Charles listened. She left the Netherlands more stable than she found it. Mary of Hungary governed from 1531 to 1555, 24 years, through the Italian wars and the worst financial pressures of the Habsburg system. Charles consulted her on everything. She pushed back when she needed to. She held. And now there is a 3rd regent. She arrives in Brussels in October 1559 with the same title, the same palace, and the same council chamber, and a written rule book from her brother in Madrid. Her predecessors received guidance. Margaret of Parma has received a list. Margaret was born in 1522. Her mother, Johanna van der Genst, was the daughter of a Flemish tapestry worker who served in the household of a provincial governor. Her father was Charles V. She was, in other words, the emperor's illegitimate daughter, and that fact would be a part of her throughout her life. It accompanied her into the Italian courts she navigated as a teenager, into every room in Brussels where she sought to govern, and into every noble's private judgment of whether she deserved respect. She spent her early years in the Low Countries. She knew Margaret of Austria's court. She knew Mary of Hungary's court. The woman Philip sent back to govern the Netherlands had spent her childhood watching those two women rule it, and she had seen what the job looked like when it was done properly. At 10, she was sent to Italy. At 13, she was married to Alessandro de' Medici, Duke of Florence, a man 27 years her senior and one of the most dangerous political operators on the peninsula. He was murdered in 1537. Margaret was 15. Charles arranged a second marriage to Ottavio Farnese, 2 years younger than Margaret, a man she did not like and never warmed to, but who brought with him the Duchy of Parma and a position in Italian politics. There is a remark recorded about the second marriage, attributed to Margaret herself, that it was her fate never to receive a suitable husband. Married as a child to a man twice her age, and now as a grown woman to a boy of 13. By 1559, Margaret of Parma had spent 20 years immersing herself in the complex politics of Italian courts, where a single misstep could be fatal. She observed Florence under the Medici and Rome under the Farnese. Contrary to how Philip's administration perceives her, as compliant, dependent, and consistently subordinate, she is actually seasoned, politically sharp, and adept at assessing situations accurately and responding effectively. 3 things she brings to Brussels that her biography attributes to her, and that Philip apparently does not credit. The first is the instinct to read a room accurately and to act when the window is open. Italian court politics teaches you that. Hesitate, and you lose the moment. The second is cultural fluency. Margaret has Dutch blood on her mother's side. She spent her early childhood here. She knows the language, Flemish and French, and in her bones, something of the culture that Philip spent 4 years in the Netherlands failing to understand. She is not the foreigner. His Spanish officials are the foreigners. The third thing she brings is correspondence. Her letters to Philip, the ones that survive in the great edition compiled by the Belgian archivist Gachard, are among the most politically perceptive documents of the Dutch revolt. She writes with clarity and urgency. She tells Philip what is happening, what it means, and what needs to be done. She is repeatedly right about all of it. And Philip writes back. There is a letter in the Gachard collection, Philip to Margaret, August 1563, that tells you almost everything you need to know about this relationship. Margaret has just sent him a long, carefully argued dispatch on the political crisis building around Cardinal Granvelle, the grandee's grievances, the structural dangers, and the urgency of the situation. Philip's reply addresses the garrison at Tournai, a question about the Fugger family's financial affairs, and a dispute over a military commission. He does not mention Grenville and does not address the political crisis at all. A courier has carried Margaret's urgent political analysis from Brussels to Madrid. Weeks pass, weeks during which the situation shifts, deteriorates, and becomes harder to manage. What comes back is administrative paperwork. This is not Philip failing to read her letters. This is Philip's governing system, working as designed. She reports. He eventually decides on his own time scale, informed by his counsels in Madrid. The gap between political reality in Brussels and Madrid's political response is no accident. It is the architecture. Before we move on to the Council of State, there's just one more detail to share. Margaret traveled to Brussels without her son. Alessandro Farnese, also known as Alexander, was born in 1545. He was only 14 when his mother took on the role of regent. He stayed in Italy for a while before being sent to the Spanish court in Madrid, where he grew up alongside Don John of Austria and the often troubled Don Carlos. These two boys were part of Philip's household in the early 1560s. Let's set them aside for now. They'll return later to these same provinces as Philip's governors in another generation. While Margaret was denied authority and trust, her son would eventually hold full power in these regions. Philip gave Margaret an institution, the Council of State. She presided over it. On the council sat the Netherlands' greatest names: Orange, Egmont, Horn. Men who had fought in the Habsburg Wars and expected, in return, to govern. They were Knights of the Golden Fleece. They had earned their seats. What they had not earned, and what Philip had no intention of giving them, was influence over policy. Within the full council, there was a smaller body, the consulta, comprising Granvelle, Viglius, and Berlaymont. This was where decisions were prepared, where the business that mattered was worked through before anything reached the wider table. The grandees on the outer council were, in practice, ornamental. Their job was to lend the regency the legitimacy of their names. Policy came from the consulta and went to Madrid. However, there was even more detailed layer that most English language histories overlook. Rockfall, basing his research on archival materials, clarifies this. Whenever a vacancy arose in a major Brabant city, such as for a magistrate or a civil official, Philip ordered Margaret to handle consultations informally within the triumvirate, without involving Orange and Egmont. This was for a specific reason. The Brabant cities formed the core of the provincial estates' opposition, which the grandees supported. If Orange and Egmont influenced the appointment of civic magistrates, they could install officials sympathetic to their interests. subsequently affecting guild leadership and estates representation. This exclusion was deliberate and precisely targeted. At the center of it all sat Antoine Perronneau de Granvelle. He was Bishop of Arras when Philip parted, Cardinal by 1561, and Archbishop of Mechelen and Primate of the Netherlands Church shortly thereafter. His father had been Charles V's chief minister. He had managed affairs of state since his 20s. He was not a villain. He was a genuine political realist, doing exactly what Philip had appointed him to do, keeping the Netherlands governable within the parameters Philip had set. The Burgundian memorist Pontus Payon, who was not Granvelle's enemy, put the structural fact plainly. He wrote that Margaret had the general government of affairs, while Granvelle was her principal counselor, the man in whom the king placed his trust above all others. Orange understood this mechanism. He told his confederates, Payon records the conversation, that everything they raised in the Council of State and everything they wrote to Philip received its answer only through Granvelle's advice. Even after Granvelle physically withdrew to Burgundy, he did not cease to govern the Low Countries. His correspondence with Philip continued. The channel was the man, not his presence in the room. So let's step back and take a look at the system Philip built. Margaret had formal authority, but she could not exercise it independently. Granvelle had policy influence. He had no executive authority of his own. The grandees held social power and military commands. They were excluded from real decisions. In Madrid, Philip had the final word on everything, operating on a timescale measured in weeks, governing provinces where the situation changed in days. Margaret sat the center of this and could not fix it. Fixing it would have required Philip to trust her judgment more than he trusted Granvelle's. But he did not. She was not failing. The system was incoherent by design. The structural tensions Philip had built into the Regency did not take long to manifest as political crises. In the first 2 years, 3 pressure points emerged. Each followed the same pattern. Margaret saw the problem clearly, told Philip, and Philip responded too slowly, too partially, or not at all. The first were the Spanish troops. When Philip left the Netherlands in 1559, he left behind something, approximately 3,000 Spanish veterans, quartered across the provinces. The Estate General had formally and repeatedly declared that this violated Netherlandish privileges. The provinces had not invited these men. They had not voted money for them. They wanted them gone. Margaret agreed. Her letters on this point were unhedged. She understood the political danger of leaving the soldiers in place, the resentment they bred, and how their presence fed the narrative of Spanish occupation. Philip resisted through 1560, arguing that instability in France made a reliable regiment in the Netherlands strategically valuable. He was not wrong strategically. He was disastrously wrong politically. The estates held their ground. Without tax money, the soldiers went unpaid. Without pay, they grew mutinous. Philip capitulated. The Spanish troops embarked from Zealand in January 1561, sailing south to replace the losses Spain had suffered in the Mediterranean. A small victory for Margaret, but notice what it required. Not her authority, not Philip's trust in her political judgment, the estate's control of the money, used as leverage until Philip had no choice. The second pressure point was the church. The reorganization of the Netherlandish church had been negotiated secretly between Philip and Rome and announced publicly only in 1561. 14 new bishoprics and 3 new archbishoprics were established. The new bishops were to be serious theologians, men formed in the spirit of the Council of Trent, not noble younger sons placed in comfortable sees by their families. 2 canons in each new chapter were designated as inquisitors. The whole structure had been redrawn, and nobody outside Philip's innermost circle had been consulted. The secrecy was politically catastrophic. Members of the Council of State learned of the new appointments from papal briefs rather than from Philip. The abbots of Brabant, who were losing revenues to the new sees, found themselves sharing a grievance with the nobles, who were losing a traditional avenue for younger sons, and with the towns, which feared intensified religious persecution. Granvelle was made Archbishop of Mechlin and Primate of the Netherlands. The king's man, already resented, was now also the leading voice of the Brabant Church in the provincial estates. Margaret understood the danger and told Philip. Philip considered the reorganization a spiritual obligation and was not prepared to reverse it. The third pressure point was the heresy placards. These were standing laws criminalizing Protestant worship, laws that had been on the books for decades and, under Charles V, had been enforced with some discretion. Philip's instructions to Margaret were unambiguous. Enforce them. The placard itself, as even Granvelle acknowledged privately, was badly drafted. It condemned recantation and obstinacy equally, rendering repentance legally worthless. That had never been Charles's intention. It was a real administrative failure, not merely a political one. But Philip's instruction was not open to interpretation. Enforce it. Margaret's political judgment was equally clear. Enforcing the placards would only inflame the provinces and lead to the disorder they aimed to prevent. Calvinist communities in Antwerp, Ghent, and towns across Flanders would not disperse over a placard. Such enforcement would push them underground, providing them with a rallying point, and would stir civic authorities concerned about trade disruptions to side with the persecuted communities. The potential costs would far outweigh any possible benefits. She was right. Philip did not yield. By the end of 1561, Margaret of Parma had served as regent for 2 years. Take stock of what she had accomplished. She had held the Council of State together, presided over it, kept the grandees at the table, and absorbed their frustrations with Granvelle, their anger over the bishoprics, and their formal protests about the soldiers. She had relayed all of it to Philip, accurately and with full political force. Her dispatches were not hedged reports from a nervous deputy. They were the clear-eyed analysis of a woman who understood the Netherlands better than the sovereign to whom she was reporting. She secured the withdrawal of the Spanish troops, a tangible result, through sustained pressure and political patience, working the correspondence until Philip had no alternative. And she had done all of this within a system that gave her the title of regent while denying her the authority that title implied. So return now to where the episode began. 3 regents. Margaret of Austria governed the Netherlands on Charles V's behalf and left it more stable than she found it. Her correspondence with Charles was a genuine political dialogue, a sovereign and a trusted deputy thinking through the same problems together. When she disagreed, he listened. Not always immediately, not always completely, but he listened. Mary of Hungary governed for 24 years. She held the provinces through the worst of the Italian wars, through financial crises and military emergencies, were Charles's trust and ear. Margaret of Parma writes to Philip. Her letters are lucid, urgent, and politically informed. Philip writes back about the Fugger accounts. The structure is not broken. It is doing exactly what Philip designed it to do. That is the problem. The question this episode closes on is not whether Margaret of Parma was capable of the task she was given. She was. She had the formation, the intelligence, and the political clarity the moment required. The question is whether the system Philip II built allowed anyone to be capable enough. There is a passage written by the Artois nobleman Pontus Payon, a loyalist, a Catholic, a man who believed in the Spanish system even as he watched it destroy what it was meant to protect. Writing after the catastrophe, Payon looked back on the Regency he had lived through and set down these words. When I remember the magnificence of the court of Brussels and the triumphant state of these provinces, at the time when they were governed by the noble and virtuous Duchess of Parma, I cannot hold back my tears, seeing them today hurled from the summit of happiness into extreme ruin and dissolution. A loyalist weeping over what the system destroyed. He also called Margaret one of the clearest sighted of her time. He was right about that too. But clarity of sight within the governing system Philip II built for the Netherlands was not enough. It never would be. As 1561 turns into 1562, the grandees are beginning to understand that. Orange, Egmont, and Horn are still at the council table, but they are watching Granvelle with a fury that is becoming increasingly difficult to contain. The campaign to remove him is coming, and Margaret will find herself caught between the grandees she privately agrees with and the sovereign she cannot openly challenge. The next episode will examine Granvelle's fall from grace. As always, maps and other supporting resources for all episodes are listed in the episode description. In the meantime, for more historical content, become a free or paid Substack subscriber and get related historical content delivered to your inbox. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads. Feedback and comments are welcome at itakehistory@gmail.com, or you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. You can also help support this podcast by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/itakehistory. If you know anyone else who would enjoy this podcast, please let them know. And thanks for listening.